start, does anyone have questions from the floor? Any specific questions? Katie, do you have a question for Mr. Tatchell? Yeah.
Yeah, just the way that you're talking there about how we're becoming less homophobic as a society and how more people are likely to engage in like homosexual relationships. Do you feel like that is undergoing a significant change right now in regards to simply having sexual exploration, or do you think it's genuinely changing relationships? Because specifically in college, like, I do feel like there is a very open mindset right now in regards to trying things out purely in a physical sense when it comes to not just identity but in pursuing emotional romantic attraction with people of the same sex. That's still heavily stigmatized within our heteronormative society. It's only sex that we're meant to be pursuing.
Yeah, I think it's a trend which is perhaps first exhibiting in terms of sexual exploration, the idea of let's try it and see. But I think that logically, it's likely over time to also push those boundaries in terms of, same-sex, emotional, long-term relationships. If the inhibitions against those relationships are fading, and for most people it's not an issue, then I believe that in the long term, more people are going to be open to that possibility on both a sexual and emotional relationship level. But of course it cuts both ways. I think we could also find some people who perhaps initially may see themselves as lesbian, gay or bisexual, also perhaps being open to the possibility that in this freer, more open society, that they feel relaxed about exploring their straight side as well. So I think it's a two-way process, but I think given that the inhibitions are overwhelmingly against same-sex relations, and that's the likely drift of the future.
For those who don't know, you tried to arrest Robert Mugabe, didn't you? What were you feeling? What were you feeling like at that moment when you tried to go up to and arrest him?
Well, those who don't know, twice in London in 1999 and in Brussels in 2001, at the request of Zimbabwean human rights and democracy activists, I was asked to do something to highlight the abuses of the Mugabe regime. So initially I organised some pickets outside the Zimbabwean embassy, which sort of made an impact, but nothing really big and dramatic. So I thought we have to do something a bit more challenging. If we want to get public awareness, we have to do something that's really going to get the news headlines. So I hit on the idea of using British and international human rights law against torture to try and get Mugabe arrested. But I knew that governments would not do that. I knew that governments were cowardly. They hid behind the tradition that heads of state have immunity from prosecution. So I decided to use the power of citizen's arrest. In most countries, and certainly in Britain, a private citizen has the right to arrest a person if they have evidence that they have committed a crime. And I had the evidence supplied by Amnesty International that Robert Mugabe had committed or authorized the committing of the crime of torture against two black journalists, Ray Choto and Mark Chavanduka, who worked for the Standard newspaper in Harare. So of course then I had to wait and think, well, how and where can I execute this planned citizen's arrest? And then in late October 1999, at about midnight, I received a phone call from a man with a strong African accent who simply said, "You may be interested to know that President Mugabe has arrived in London tonight on a private shopping trip. He is staying at the St. James's Court Hotel in Victoria, and he'll be returning to Zimbabwe via Heathrow Airport at 6 p.m. on Saturday night." Before I could ask any questions, the caller hung up. So I thought to myself, is this a hoax or is it genuine? I decided to punt with the idea that it was a genuine call. So the next morning, I contacted Amnesty International and got a dossier directly implicating President Mugabe in the torture of these two journalists. That was the lawful, legal basis for his arrest. And then I phoned around lots of activists to ask if they would help me try and arrest him as he left his hotel on the Saturday morning, because I knew he'd have to leave at some point to go to the airport to get his flight. I've never heard so many people give so many quasi-plausible excuses. I'm going away for the weekend, my girlfriend's coming to stay, I've got to go shopping to get a new razor. In the end, the only people I could find who were willing were 3 other members of the LGBT Direct Action Group Outrage. You know, obviously, Mugabe is homophobic, but we weren't doing it over that issue. We were doing it over the crime of torture. Anyway, these 3 activists agreed to meet me on the Saturday morning outside his hotel. I also phoned up a journalist, a video person, and a cameraman to independently corroborate and record what we were doing. It was a freezing cold morning. And when you're nervous and when you're skinny like me, you really feel the cold. I was shivering with the cold, even though I was ostensibly quite well rugged up. So we lay in wait outside his hotel from 8:30 in the morning, not knowing when he'd come out, but we knew he had to come out at some point. We tried to look inconspicuous. One guy stood in a phone box pretending to make phone calls. Another one stood at a bus stop pretending to wait for a bus. Another one stood by reading a newspaper. I was hovering around looking in shop windows. But hey, come 10:30, 2 hours, the concierge of the hotel, the guy with the top hat and tails who greets visitors, started looking and staring intently at us. And I concluded he had obviously noticed our presence. And I thought to myself, if he's suspicious, you know, Mugabe, if he's in the hotel, at this stage we didn't know, Mugabe won't come out or he'll call the police. So I started to get really, really anxious. And to answer your question, yes, not only was I shivering with the cold because I was so nervous, my stomach was churning over. I had a splitting headache from the nervous tension. I had the urge to defecate and urinate because I was so nervous. Somehow I was holding it together, just about. It was quite a horrific experience because I was nervous for 2 reasons. First of all, I was afraid that we might get rumbled and the whole thing would go to pieces. We wouldn't succeed. And I was nervous also because I thought if this comes out, it probably will make world headlines and it will help raise international awareness about the human rights abuses that are happening in Zimbabwe. So I felt those twin pressures. Plus, of course, there's a fear of being arrested and roughed up by the police and possibly even beaten up, either by the police or by Mugabe's bodyguards. Anyway, the upshot was that not long after the concierge came down and seemed to clock us, about maybe 15 or 20 minutes later, from the side vehicle entrance appeared 5 or 6 African-looking guys. And they started pointing at us. And I thought, 2 things. First of all, they've got to be Mugabe's bodyguards. He must be in the hotel. And then the second thought was, if they're suspicious, he won't come out, or he'll come out under armed guard, or they'll call the police. And as soon as the police see me, given my history of direct action, they will know that something's up and the whole thing will go to pieces. So in those circumstances, it's very hard to think on your feet. When you've got this splitting headache, you're shivering, your stomach's churning over. But amazingly, somehow, I had a brainwave. So I walked across the road, smiling and beaming and holding up my hand to shake the guys' hands. I said, "Hi guys, I'm from the News of the World. And these are my other journalists and my photographer and video person. We've had a tip-off that Elton John is in the hotel with his new boyfriend. We've got to get the story and photographs for tomorrow's paper." And they looked at me like I was crazy. I said to them, because they were hesitating, I said to them, I will give you £50 if you tell me which room he's in. They shook their heads. I'll give you £75. I only had £10 in my pocket. Then I said, they still weren't buying it. I'll give you £100. Please, we've got to get this story for the next day's paper, for Sunday's paper. Please, please tell us. They still kept shaking their heads. And then I had another idea. I turned to one of them and said, I know you. You are part of Elton John's security team because I saw you at his Wembley concert 2 months ago. There was no Wembley concert 2 months ago. You wouldn't be here if Elton wasn't in this hotel. You can't fool me. I'll give you £100. He burst out laughing. And then they started speaking in Shona or Nebadili, the Zimbabwean languages. And they all burst out laughing, and then they walked off. And I thought to myself, I think I might have convinced them. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, from the side vehicle entrance, out came President Mugabe in his limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate to my colleagues further up the street there was him in the car, and they ran straight out in front of his speeding limousine. It screeched to a halt about 6 inches from their legs. Then one of them ran behind the car so it couldn't move forward and couldn't move backward. I ran from the side and opened the rear door. Amazingly, it was unlocked. And there before me was President Mugabe of Zimbabwe sitting in the front back seat. I gently leaned in and took his arm with my right hand and held out my left hand with an open palm to show I didn't have a weapon. I said, President Mugabe, you're under arrest on charges of torture. Torture is a crime under international law. I am now summoning the police. You should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but a visible ashen pallor came across his face. He recoiled in his seat, his eyes popped, his jaw dropped, he held up his hands. I think he thought he was going to be killed. To which I thought in my mind, now you know what your victims feel like. Only we're not going to kill you. We're going to take you to a court of law where you'll have a chance to defend yourself. So we summoned the police. Initially, only 3 officers turned up. And there were 4 of us. So it took 2 officers to remove each of us from the car. So they'd take one person from the car and put them on the pavement, and then go back to get another person. Meanwhile, the person on the pavement would then run back in front of the car. This went on for about 10 or 15 minutes until about 20 police reinforcements arrived, and we were very aggressively, violently removed by the police. We spent nearly 7 hours in Belgravia police station while the police discussed about 10 or 12 different charges they were going to do us for. Obstructing the highway, criminal damage, assaulting the police, riot and affray. They were all complete fiction, apart from perhaps obstructing the highway. Meanwhile, President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. On the opening day of our trial, our defence counsel informed the prosecution that we would be submitting video and photographic evidence of the entire incident, which would show that up to 15 police officers were perjuring themselves. Within minutes, it was announced that all the charges were dropped. So we never faced that trial. I think also, not only did they fear the fact that the evidence would show the police were lying, but it also might give encouragement to other people that they could use the power of citizen's arrest to bring human rights abusers to justice. I think neither the government nor the prosecutors nor police wanted to have that issue ventilated and possibly succeed in a court of law. In the weeks and months afterwards, I received about 5,000 emails, mostly from people inside Zimbabwe, and many of them black Zimbabweans. This was at a time when email was not that popular, particularly in Zimbabwe. And they nearly all said the same thing. You didn't succeed in arresting Mugabe, but you got global attention to his human rights abuses. We thought no one cared. We thought no one knew. So reflecting on that, I think it was a big psychological boost, I guess. A big psychological boost for people in Zimbabwe to know that people in a faraway country like the UK knew what was happening in Zimbabwe, cared about what was happening, and were trying to do something. So psychologically and emotionally, I think it worked, even though we did not succeed, and even though today, shockingly and amazingly, the tyrant is still in power.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. Phil, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do indeed. You've obviously campaigned for 50 years for LGBTQ plus rights in the UK and around the world. What, at each defining stage, what is the defining stage in your life? That's my first question. And the second stage is, at times like Robert Mugabe incident, what inspired you to make that leap? What was your thought that was going through your head that, obviously you said you felt all these emotions, but what really kicked you to take that leap and not be afraid to make a change or to make a point to not just the UK but to the entire world that people and individuals could make a difference?
I guess what helped me overcome my fear, and I did have a real fear. I mean, the bodyguards could have been armed, they could have shot me and my colleagues. The car they ran in front of could have not braked and could have mowed them down. It was a dangerous, some might say even reckless thing to do. But we were motivated by our love and compassion for the people in Zimbabwe who were suffering, and who, in those days, no one seemed to care about. And we also put it in perspective. The people in Zimbabwe were in far greater danger than we ever would be. I mean, in those days, people in Zimbabwe who were opposition activists campaigning for democracy and human rights were being executed. Were being shot, tortured, jailed, detained without trial. So we felt we had a real personal responsibility to take a few risks, which were nothing by comparison to the risks being taken by the activists in Zimbabwe. So we were really inspired by them and inspired by their courage to take what was, by comparison, relatively minor risks. In terms of my trajectory of LGBT campaigning, I would just hasten to add that all throughout my half a century of campaigning, LGBT rights have been part of it, but not the only part. To me, human rights are a broad spectrum. LGBT rights are part of that spectrum, but not the only part. So, for example, just on Monday, I was at the United Nations in Geneva, speaking at a side event for the Human Rights Council on human rights abuses in Pakistan. Nothing to do with LGBT rights, although I'm sure as an openly gay man, the fact that I was challenging the human rights abusers and supporting civil society groups there helped, I hope, raise awareness about LGBT issues or made some people in Pakistan rethink their attitudes towards LGBT issues. In terms of the things I've done over the years, I mean, I don't want to, go into all the details, but I would say that every single campaign, it's never been me alone. I've always been working with others, and I couldn't have done any of the things I've done without the support of others. So if I look back to, 1972, when I invaded and interrogated a symposium at St Thomas's Hospital in London, which was being addressed by the man who was then probably the world's most famous psychologist, Professor Hans Eysenck, who was justifying the use of electric shock aversion therapy to cure homosexuality. I did that because I knew someone in the Gay Liberation Front, of which I was a part, who'd been through that kind of treatment and how it had emotionally, psychologically, and sexually caused him such damage. So when I did that, I did it for him and all the others. In 1973, I was a delegate to the World Festival of Youth and Students in what was then communist East Germany, where I staged a series of protests in support of LGBT rights. Again inspired by the fact that in those communist countries at that stage, there were no LGBT movements. They were all banned. Anybody who tried to form one would be arrested and jailed. There was no visibility for LGBT issues. But I knew that at this festival, tens of thousands of students from communist countries would be there, and it would be an opportunity to conscientize them around LGBT issues. And yes, I was arrested and interrogated by the Stasi. I was even physically violently attacked by hardline communist members of the British delegation. But again, I did it because I felt it was necessary and important, that something bigger than me was involved. I was just the messenger. And then there's been other things. Maybe you'll know that I stood in the Bermondsey by-election in 1983 in southeast London as a left-wing gay rights supporting candidate and was subjected to what most commentators regard as the dirtiest, most violent and homophobic election in Britain during the 20th century. I had over 150 violent physical assaults on the doorsteps, 50 attacks upon my flat, including bricks and bottles through the windows, 3 arson attempts, and even a bullet through the front door. But again, I did it because I had the support of people in the local Labour Party who stood by me, and many others, who believed in the issues that I was raising, which were not issues that were mainstream in those days. For example, I was arguing in 1983 in that election that British troops should come out of the north of Ireland, that there should be a negotiated political settlement with protections for both communities. I was denounced as an extremist, a supporter of terrorism, but I stuck to my guns, and many people did eventually get the message. And much, much later, in the late 1990s, with the peace process, all those ideas that were denounced as extremist in 1983 came to pass. There'll be many others. I mean, I'll just run through one or two. I mean, some of you will remember that myself and my outraged colleagues named 10 Anglican bishops in 1994, calling them to tell the truth. They were gay, but part of a church that was anti-gay, part of a church that was denouncing gay people. And we felt it was right to call out the homophobia and hypocrisy that they were colluding with. It led to me and Outrage being denounced as queer terrorists, I think one newspaper called us. I was condemned as public enemy number one. I wear all these badges with a degree of pride. Then 4 years later, a group of us, again from Outrage, walked into the pulpit of the Archbishop of Canterbury on Easter Sunday during his Easter sermon. We didn't interrupt the sacred parts of the service, but when he began his sermon, we walked into the pulpit and criticised him over the fact that he was urging members of Parliament to vote against gay equality. He was advocating discrimination in law. He wasn't merely saying that homosexuality is sinful and that gays should repent. He was saying the law of the land should discriminate. So we called him out on that. And that has resulted in my only standing conviction. Out of over 3,000 direct action protests over the last half century, I've only got one standing conviction, and that was for Easter Sunday. And I was eventually charged and convicted under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And under that law, any kind of interruption of a minister of religion in a place of worship is deemed to be, quote, indecent behaviour. So I'm convicted of indecent behaviour in Canterbury Cathedral under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860. The magistrate listened to my defence and he concluded that yes, I'd been polite and courteous, I hadn't insulted or abused the Archbishop or the Christian religion, but he did say that you did interrupt the service and that is clearly against the law, therefore I find you guilty. He could have fined me £5,000 and sent me to prison for 6 months. Instead, I was fined the sum of £18.60. His reference to the 1860 Act under which I was convicted. What else have I done? Oh, well, in 2003, in the lead up to the Iraq War, I ambushed Tony Blair's motorcade, forcing it to halt in Piccadilly. And among other things, I decided not to go gently, so I held on to the under chassis of the car. And it took about 3 or 4 special branch officers to heave me off. It took them about a minute. It seemed like an eternity, but I clung on for dear life. And there was a good grip under the chassis, you see. But in the end, I was pulled away, and as I was pulled away, my fingertips clipped the number plate, and 3 of the screws popped out. So Tony Blair's number plate was left swinging by 1 screw. What else have I done? I can't remember else. But there's been a lot of interesting, fun things, some quite dangerous, perhaps even reckless. But there's been a lot of things that I think have been worth doing. I mean, the final one I'll mention is, of course, going to support Moscow Pride in Russia. I went in the end 5 times, but in 2007, I was set upon by neo-Nazis and quite badly beaten. Detained by the police there for several hours. But fortunately, because I had a British passport, they decided it probably was best not to prosecute me. The other thing I should mention just briefly is the second attempt to arrest Mugabe, which happened in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Brussels in 2001, where as he was walking through the lobby, I was waiting for him. I got a tip off that he was going to be there, and sort of posed as a foolish tourist in one of these boutiques in the lobby, and then sort of walked out into the middle of his entourage as he walked past. I actually got within about 3 feet of him, and I held up my hand. And smiled. That disarmed the bodyguards. They thought I was a friend or, a well-wisher. So because I was smiling and had my hand held out to shake his hand, I got really quite close to him, just within about 3 feet or less. And I said, President Mugabe, the same thing, you're under arrest on charges of torture. To which I was grabbed. And if any of you have seen the video on YouTube, it's quite painful for me to watch, to hear the cracking thud of the fist on my skull. Anyway, I was dragged off to the corner of the hotel lobby and beaten by his bodyguards. Meanwhile, his other bodyguards piled Mugabe into the lift. Into the revolving door to get out of the hotel. And they tried to push the door and it jammed. There were about 6 of them in the lift, in the revolving door with him. And so it was stuck, so they started screaming to the bodyguards who were beating me up to come and help release the revolving door. And while they did that, I scrambled out the fire exit into the street and then confronted Mugabe on the other side of the revolving door. So he was on one side of the glass, I was on the other side, only about 2 feet separating us. I was shouting, Mugabe, torturer, Mugabe, murderer, arrest Mugabe. Then I was seized by the Belgian secret police. They then slammed me up against the plate glass windows of the Hilton Hotel. And then once they got out of the revolving door, some of the bodyguards came over and then started slapping me and beating me. The Belgian security guards, Belgian Secret Service and police just stood there and watched. But then some camera people from news crews surrounded the bodyguards and demanded to know, who are you? Why are you beating this man? And while they were distracted looking at the journalists, I scrambled between their legs and ran out into the driveway just as President Mugabe's limousine was leaving and stopped it. But that was when I got stopped. Then the bodyguards came over, and then I was beaten so bad I was knocked unconscious. And I woke up a little bit. No, I think I was only out of consciousness, probably 30 seconds, a minute or 2 minutes at the most, I don't know. But anyway, by that time he'd gone. Anyway, I thought to myself, I know where he's going. I haven't finished with him. He was going to meet the Belgian Prime Minister at his private residence. So I hailed a lift from a journalist, passing journalist who was going there as well, who turned up late. And then stood outside the gates of the private residence shouting, "Mugabe murderer, Mugabe torturer, arrest Mugabe." Anyway, I've got very good voice projection. They could hear it inside. So then Mugabe's minders came out, and this time reached inside their jackets. And the police screamed at me, "They've got guns, run." And then tried to block their path. So I just ran, and I don't know whether they had guns or not, but anyway, I got away. And that was the end of that story.
Do you have a question from the floor? Anybody? Yourself, Nick?
Hi there. So you're obviously quite a fan of direct action. However, I'm from the UK, and I know recently there's been somewhat of an issue with the NUS, someone in the NUS trying to no-platform you, and you yourself condemn no-platforming on campuses in a newspaper. I was wondering if you, for the new human rights campaigners of this generation, do you think there's ever a place for no-platforming or anything like that, or is it always direct action that is the answer for human rights abuses?
Well, of course, the history in Britain of no-platforming was in the 1970s, when it was initially conceived to block far-right extremists like the National Front from speaking because they were advocating or inciting potential violence against black and ethnic minority communities. So it was very strictly defined against Nazis and Nazi-type organizations that were threatening and menacing human rights. What's happened today is that it's been broadened out and interpreted much more widely to basically include anyone who some students disagree with. Now, some of the people that have been no-platformed, I happen to totally oppose their views, but I'm not sure that no-platforming is the way to deal with it. I think it's probably better to let them speak and then challenge and question them, then expose them and to show why their views are wrong. Because if you no-platform them, nothing changes. They're not challenged. You don't get an opportunity to show them up for who they are. I think, for example, of the case of Nick Griffin, the leader of the far-right BNP, who was invited on BBC Question Time. Many people were opposed to it. And I must admit, I was opposed to it because of his extremist history. And he wasn't just disagreeable, he was putting forward ideas that were directly threatening and menacing to human rights. But in the end, his appearance on BBC Question Time was actually the best thing that could have happened, because Bonnie Greer and other panelists tore him to shreds. He emerged from that program discredited in front of a whole national audience. And that would have never happened if he'd simply been no-platformed and denied the opportunity to speak. With regard to myself, strictly speaking, I was not no-platformed. What happened was the NUS LGBT officer, Fran Cowling, said she wasn't prepared to share a platform with me. Now, you could say that she was effectively inviting the organisers to disinvite me if they wanted to hear her. But strictly speaking, I wasn't no-platformed. And what was really bad about that case was that she made the false claim that she didn't want to speak with me because I was transphobic and racist. But when asked to provide evidence of transphobia and racism, she couldn't, because there is none. I'm not flawless, I'm not perfect, but I don't think racism or transphobia are things that I can be accused of. So there are two issues here. First of all, the widening, broadening use of no-platforming. And secondly, the fact that some people are prepared to lie to make a political point. And I think that's really dangerous, because free speech and democratic open debate depends upon exactly that. Being able to hear and challenge disagreeable opinions, and on honesty. If you're not prepared to be honest, if you're prepared to lie about another person, to make false allegations of racism and transphobia, then you really have lost the plot. You've lost all moral authority, and you're undermining a fabric of democratic open debate, because it's got to be based upon honesty and truthfulness. We can't go around lying about people if we're going to have a genuine, free and open debate. So on all those areas, I think that the no platform policy has probably gone too far. I mean, there are organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir who are no platformed by the National Union of Students in the UK. And they are an extremist Islamist organisation that opposes democracy, opposes human rights. They support the establishment of a religious dictatorship. And they would put to death Muslims who give up their faith or don't share their particular brand of Islam, women who had sex outside of marriage, LGBT people, and many others. So I think that's probably right that they are no platform too. But if people happen to hold an Islamist point of view and they're not endorsing or inciting murder, I think they should be heard and challenged, but otherwise not banned. I also think that there's an allied policy of safe space where there's a very good intention to ensure that student meetings are welcoming, inclusive and open to everyone, that no one feels intimidated by the atmosphere. And that's a good idea. I mean, we don't want to tolerate racism, misogyny or homophobia in a student meeting. But again, it's being much more widely and broadly interpreted to encompass any disagreeable opinion. So for example, the Iranian communist and feminist Maryam Namazi, when she went to speak, she was invited to speak at Goldsmiths College in London, and people tried to get her disinvited because they said she would violate their safe space policy because she was anti-Islam. Well, she's not anti-Islam, she's anti-Islamist extremism for a start. And secondly, she's a great defender of feminism and multiculturalism. So again, lying is a factor here there, and also just not allowing a free and open debate. You probably all heard the case of Imogen Wilson at Edinburgh University, who raised her hand during a debate in disagreement, and there was a vote actually taken to remove her from the meeting on the grounds that merely by raising her hand, she had violated the safe space policy. And apparently the safe space policy says you can raise your hand in agreement only, not in disagreement. Well, hang on. How can you have an open debate and a meeting if you can't allow people to express agreement or disagreement in a polite, courteous way?
Yes, I could have questions all night. So you were talking in your lecture about the post-sexuality world. Would you see, over the last, obviously, few years, we've had a major change in Ireland anyway, in the cultural and social and political concept of what sexuality is. And that's happening around the Western world. But what will that look like to you, and do you think that's a reality within the grasp of this generation here tonight? Do you think it's something that could be achievable in a realistic time frame in the next few years even, if we continue to fight? And what advice would you give to a person, you're saying that we should be also campaigning for human rights? Is there anything that we could be doing better as a younger generation to fight for human rights, and not just LGBTQ plus rights?
Well, first of all, I take your point about the huge progress made in Ireland, although not in the north, where the battle for same-sex marriage still continues. And I was very proud to support the recent petition that was handed on yesterday. 20,000 people signed a petition calling for marriage equality, a huge positive achievement. And what is really inspiring and somewhat surprising, only about a decade or so ago, according to surveys, the north of Ireland was deemed to be the most homophobic place in Western Europe. In terms of public attitudes towards LGBT issues, it was the most homophobic place. Yet amazingly, just over a decade later, 68% of Northern Irish people now support marriage equality. Wonderful, amazing. I pay tribute to the people there for the change of hearts and minds that has taken place. You're right, of course. What's happening in Ireland, North and South, and what's happening in the rest of Europe, the United States, and so on, is of course very different from what's happening in many parts of the world, in the Middle East, parts of Asia, Africa, and Central America. We still have a long, long, long way to go. But there are lots of glimmers of hope. I mean, in recent years, there's been the decriminalization of homosexuality in Mozambique, Sao Tome and Principe, Nauru, Palau, Northern Cyprus, and most recently Belize, where the Supreme Court has ruled against the ban or the criminalization of homosexuality. So there are some positive gains, but there's also a backlash in countries like Russia, where they have the new law which penalizes the so-called promotion of non-traditional sexual relations. There's also backsteps in the Gambia, where there's increasing social repression of LGBT people, and where the president has warned LGBT people to leave the Gambia or face beheading. In Brunei, a member of the Commonwealth, they've recently introduced a new harsh version of Sharia law which stipulates the death penalty for LGBT people. So there's lots of backward steps. But overall, the global trend is going in the right direction. Not fast enough, not far enough, but what's really inspiring is that in almost every country in the world, there are now LGBT movements. Some overt, some secret. So for example, in Sudan, which has the death penalty under Sharia law for same-sex relations, for about 3 or 4 years until recently, there was an LGBT movement, and it even had meetings and consultations with the government. An incredible personal risk to those individuals. They are risking not just their liberty, but their lives. But they took that risk and had those meetings. But then unfortunately, some people in the government and some of the state agencies like the police decided to go for them, so that the organization had to fold, the people had to go underground or flee abroad. But the fact they even tried is an astonishing tribute to their guts and determination to advance the cause. So, I am very, very hopeful. But going back to the second part of your question, I do think it's always very important that we see LGBT rights within the mainstream human rights movement, not as something separate. So going back to the 1980s, I always argued against LGBT exclusive laws. I always said, don't go for specific laws for LGBT people, go for broad-based laws that include LGBT people. So even going back to 1978 and 1983, when I stood as the Labour candidate in the Bermondsey by-election, I argued for a comprehensive anti-discrimination law to protect everyone, to guarantee equal treatment and non-discrimination to every person, on the grounds of race, gender, age, disability, sexuality, gender identity, and so on. So that put LGBT rights into the mainstream and enabled us to build alliances with other social movements and organizations fighting the same battles on the principle that together united we are stronger, whereas if we just battle for LGBT issues only, we're more isolated. We can be more easily picked off. We're more of a target for the hard right homophobes. So I think, both as a moral principle and as a practical principle, it's really important that we make this cause within the wider framework. And that's why in Britain, as well as championing the right of same-sex couples to marry, I've also championed the cause of heterosexual couples to have a civil partnership. Under the British civil partnership law, in England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, opposite-sex couples are not allowed to have civil partnerships. They're banned by law. And whether you agree with civil partnerships or not, the principle is everyone should be equal before the law. There should be no discrimination, and therefore straight couples should be able to have a civil partnership if they want, and some do, because they don't like the patriarchal sexist history of marriage. They prefer something more egalitarian, flexible and modern. And I think they have a right to it. So first of all through outrage, then through the Equal Love campaign, and now with the legal case that's being brought by an opposite-sex couple in the courts, I'm a very, very strong supporter of opposite-sex civil partnerships. And I say that because we depended on straight people to support us to get same-sex marriage. You know, we couldn't have got same-sex marriage without the support of straight members of the public who are our allies, straight members of parliament who are our allies, straight-friendly supporters in the media who are allies. We needed straight support to win. So therefore we have a duty to reciprocate that support, to give back to straight people. And also, take another issue, sex and relationship education in schools. Of course we need LGBT inclusive sex and relationship education in schools. But hang on, straight kids don't have very good sex and relationship education. We actually need better sex and relationship education for all kids in all schools. And it needs to be made mandatory. A legal requirement that every school does it, because at the moment, in England, Wales and Scotland, and certainly in Northern Ireland, many schools do not. First of all, their level of sex education is often very poor, even for straight kids, and many either ignore or pay only lip service to the needs of LGBT kids. So if we champion sex and relationship education mandatory in all schools for all kids, including LGBT ones, then we're creating a common alliance between straight and gay people. We're building those bridges, we're making our collective strength even better and more likely eventually to succeed.
So you're speaking about kind of like the global progression and that we're like moving forward with like egalitarian rights and like justice for people. What do you feel like far right like politics like Trump, like the Angela Merkel, like far right parties? Like, how do you feel in your view that like we're progressing as a people? What do you think of like when Trump comes in and when the far right parties come in as well?
Well, I can remember as a school student of history asking myself, how did the far right make so many gains in the 1930s? Mass unemployment, economic chaos, surely the left and progressive movement would have made gains in that era. I couldn't understand how it happened. But then I studied it and I realized partly because the left and progressive politics was divided and chaotic and disorganized, and often they didn't have a clear alternative program. So I thought to myself, surely this will never happen again, not in my lifetime. But it has. And we're seeing history repeat itself. In a time of economic recession and destabilization, we're seeing the far right make gains, not the far left. And that is really scary. And it's again for the same reasons. The left doesn't have a coherent alternative. The left is disorganized and divided. Now, call me a simpleton, but to me it's blindingly obvious. Democracy is the great mantra of our era. We expect political democracy, and to some extent we have it. But what about economic democracy? Why isn't the left championing the cause of economic democracy to parallel the political democracy we have? What would economic democracy involve? Well, it could involve things like having employee and consumer directors on the boards of public and private institutions. The National Health Service in Britain should have employee and consumer directors on the management board to represent the interests of the wider public, the consumer, and to represent the interests of the people who work in the health service. It ain't got it. When it comes to private corporations, again, we need employee and consumer representatives on those boards to hold in check and balance the people who are there, the major shareholders, the directors, the managers. Now, you can bet that if there are employee and consumer directors on the boards of the failed banks Northern Rock and RBS in 2008, you can bet if there were consumer and employee directors on those boards prior to that, they would have seen what was going on, they would have challenged it on the board, and if the board didn't listen, they would have gone public. They would have blown the whistle, and Northern Rock and RBS would not have gone into meltdown. It is so obvious. And when I talk about these ideas to members of the public, back in Britain, most people get it. At first they say, that's a bit far left, but when I explain it, they say, this makes sense. But even Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell are not arguing this case. Why not? Another idea. Why not have a one-off wealth tax on the mega rich, the multimillionaires? A one-off wealth tax of, say, an average of 20% on assets, not income, on assets. People who've got 5 or 6 homes, or 3 or 4 cars, or a private jet or yacht, can afford to give up something. Can easily afford. They're not going to wander around in sackcloth and ashes. But the money raised, if we did a one-off, average 20% wealth tax on the mega rich, the richest 10% in Britain, with perhaps a rate of only 1 or 2% on the lower end, and perhaps a rate of 25% on the mega M end, we could raise £800 billion. Enough to reboot the economy, to fill the void in the National Health Service funding, so that patients will not be deprived and go on rationing. It is doable. But again, who on the left is arguing this? I despair at the lack of ideas and vision by people on the left. There are some individuals here and there, but I've been promoting these ideas for like 20, 30 years. It just drifts over people's heads. Some people say it's too radical, which I don't believe, because I know from speaking around Britain that people do, at first they're skeptical, but then they do get it mostly. And secondly, they just think it's just beyond what is possible. I remind everyone that in the 1970s, the right wing, or vaguely left of centre, Callaghan government, remember James Callaghan, who was the British Prime Minister in the 1970s? He commissioned Lord Bollock to do a report on industrial democracy. He came up with the idea that all companies with more than 50 employees should be required by law to have equal numbers of management and employee representatives on the board, and there had to be a neutral, mutually agreed chair. 50-50. The trade unions and the left sabotaged that. They said it was corporatism. They said it was corporatism to have workers' representatives voting and empowered on the boards. These people are absolute lunatics. The trade unions wouldn't buy it for the same reason. And so the whole thing was scrapped. Can you imagine where we'd be today if that policy had been adopted? We would have better industrial relations because employee directors on the boards would be able to bring grievances directly to the management board. and hopefully that they'd be able to use their veto power on the board to make sure it was solved. We'd have better innovation, because through those employee directors, workers on the shop floor would be able to give from their own practical experience ideas about how to improve things. My father was a lathe operator in an engineering factory. He knew from the shop floor how to improve the productivity of the company. But he was a voiceless shop floor worker. He had no say. But if his ideas and the ideas of his colleagues had been adopted by the management board, the company would have been more effective, more efficient, and more profitable. Now, of course, if employees are going to contribute in that way, I don't want to see all the profits going to the shareholders and the management. So another idea is, for economic democracy, is by law require every private company to give a share of the profits of any productivity to their employees. So the employees in a company, if they contribute to a way of making the company more efficient, first of all, they should get a bonus. Bonuses shouldn't just be for fat cats at the top. And secondly, all the employees should share in the increased profits and productivity. A very famous, or perhaps not famous enough, Swedish economist, Rudolf Meissner, in the 1970s proposed a similar idea. He would call it wage earner funds. He said that any increase in productivity, a percentage of that increase should be paid as shares to the workforce in collectivity. And they would hold the shares collectively, which they could use in any way they wanted to. They could use it for voting rights on the board. They could sell them to perhaps for pension funds or welfare for the employees. Those plans were adopted in a watered down form by the Social Democratic government in Sweden. But when the Conservatives came to power, they were eventually scrapped and watered down. But even today, some of those wage earner funds survive. And it's interesting that they were mostly invested in socially useful production and in new technologies. So they became incredibly profitable. I think in Norway, their sovereign wealth fund, which is based on a wealth tax, not a wage earner fund, but a wealth tax, is one of the biggest investment funds in the world, and is what keeps the Norwegian welfare state and social welfare system going. And it also leads to really good investment. With the wage earner funds and the Norwegian sovereign fund, they've invested in all kinds of things: new medical treatments, renewable energy, cutting edge technology in terms of IT and internet, all socially useful, but also profitable. And the profits going back to the employees. Now, I haven't got all the answers. I'm not an economist. There's greater minds than mine can think even better ideas. But who are they and where are they? All I'm saying is I think these ideas deserve to be heard. These are ideas that are a new alternative to the current economic model and to the current lack of economic democracy. We live in a society in the West where we have effectively an economic dictatorship. A handful of very rich and powerful people, the major shareholders, the managers and directors, hold all the votes. They decide hiring and firing, pricing, technology, infrastructure, plant. They run it like a dictatorship. The massive employees, without whom no wealth could be created, are frozen out of decision making. And that is not fair, it's not right, and it's economically less efficient than the kinds of ideas that I've espoused to you today. So just think about it. We expect political democracy, why not economic democracy as well?
Any questions from the floor? Yeah, yourself. Yeah, you know.
So I have a question about the queer activism and like moving forward beyond marriage equality, and I can only speak from my context, which is the States. So we got marriage equality a year ago, and over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of normative strides. With now we can have gay and trans people serving in the military, but the other side of it is not discussed of how that's continuing American imperialism and violence. And of course, we still have a lot of state violence that's being committed against queer and trans people, especially for low income or people of color. And so there's a lot of issues within the community. And so I'm just thinking of like getting to a society that is like post-sexuality, because I do believe that at some point we will get there and there won't be like such a focus on like sexual identities. But it seems like before we get there, we still have quite a lot of work to do within our own communities. So I guess my question is about coalition building. I mean, we do have a lot of like queer organizations working with like Black Lives Matter, which actually was started by Black queer women. But there's not a lot of that happening. So I'm sorry, I know this is kind of like convoluted, but like how can we really like have coalition building and action that like leads to actual transformative change?
I think you raised really good points. I mean, I've been really inspired by the emergence of Black Lives Matter and Gays Against Guns. Black Lives Matter challenging police violence against black communities, and Gays Against Guns responding to the Orlando massacre by saying we have to change the law on gun ownership in the US. And those two movements can and should be working really together because there is a common cause. And I think we need to recognize also that the LGBT community is not one homogeneous whole. We reflect all the different races, ages, cultural, religious, and belief systems and ideas. And therefore, we need to link up with those parallel movements. For black LGBT people in America, it is often much tougher than if you're born into a white middle-class family. Attitudes are changing, but traditionally there was a lot of homophobia in sections of the African American community. And in particular, for LGBT Muslims, there's also a big issue about the lack of often the lack of family support. And most LGBT organizations don't really address those specific issues. They're afraid of being accused of racism or anti-Muslim prejudice. Well, the real racism is to ignore the particular needs of African American black people and who happen to be LGBT, and to ignore the real particular issues of LGBT Muslims. Ignoring that is an inverse form of Islamophobia or racism. So we have to build those alliances. You're absolutely right. And I think that what's really important is that when you look at history, you can see that the most successful movements have been ones that have been built upon coalitions and alliances, where people from diverse backgrounds and traditions have come together around a common cause. They may have some differences and different perspectives, but they've sunk those differences for the bigger, greater cause. And that's how you make progress. Uniting people is the way to move things forward. And I think it also means that we have to be self-critical on our own community, to recognize there is some racism and some anti-Muslim prejudice, for example, in the LGBT community, and also some misogyny and sexism among some gay and bisexual men. We have to face up to that in order to overcome it. We have to call it out rather than just pass it by and say, well, we're all gay together. No, we're not all gay together. Different people in the gay community have different experiences, and sometimes LGBT people can be prejudiced against other LGBT people because of their faith or race or disability or whatever. And that is not conducive to a strong and homogenous community. If we want a strong, homogenous community that's united together and effective, we need to overcome those differences so we truly can all stand together. And we also, as I said, need to recognize the specific needs and interests of particular subgroups within our community, and to not treat everyone the same. in terms of, you raised the issue about the whole issue of LGBT people in the armed forces and the historic role of US imperialism. In the days when we still had a ban on LGBT people in the armed forces in Britain up until 1999, I was involved, I very much orchestrated the campaign against the military ban, not because I supported the military, but because the ban was clearly homophobic. To ban someone because of their sexual orientation or gender identity was quite clearly homophobic or transphobic. So it had to be challenged. But our campaign was also a campaign that simultaneously argued for the democratization and reform of the armed forces. So we supported the campaign, this is outrage, we supported the campaign for greater civil and human rights for military personnel, to end the system of military court-martials where the military was arresting officer, prosecuting officer, and jailer. We argued that there needed to be stronger action to defend the equal rights of women and black ethnic minority people in the armed forces. Because in those days, particularly 20 or 30 years ago, there was a lot of racism and a lot of misogyny. So we built those links with black communities and with women, and they supported us in return. So it's always, if we each support each other, we are united, we are stronger. And in terms of Britain's overseas role, we were highly critical of Britain's historic role in the world. I mean, if you think about it, nearly all the wars that Britain has fought since 1945 were wars against colonial freedom to suppress and hold on to colonies which we had annexed mostly in the 19th century. And we felt that we didn't want to be part of and support those kinds of wars. When the campaign was really hotting up, of course, there was the first Iraq War, or the so-called Gulf War, in 1991. And we were very much part of the protest against that. Not because we supported Saddam Hussein, but we felt that the way in which the US and Britain were going into that war was probably going to be counterproductive. So having that wider human rights perspective, I think, is really important, not only in terms of building and sustaining the coalition we need to win, but also ensuring that other people support us when we need them. It's really, really important that we see beyond the narrow confines of LGBT rights, that we recognize that human rights are universal and indivisible. And if that's the case, it can't just be about LGBT rights, it's got to be human rights for everyone.
Yourself, there, will you the question?
Yes, hi. Sorry, I would like to drink the water first.
Ask the question.
It's possible you may have already addressed this because I walked in halfway through, but you were talking about safe-space policies earlier, and I wanted to ask, since I too have been growing disillusioned with the concept of a safe space as it is being applied in activist communities and colleges and so on. So what would you suggest as an alternative to ensure that that conversation can still be carried while being mindful of imbalances of social power and so on, and prejudice and so on and so forth, while also not basically like stamping out all forms of conflict as is being done in some situations today?
Well, I think what some universities are doing is the right approach. Rather than going on the road of censorship and restriction, they're saying we are going to make sure by having a black ethnic minority speaker, a woman speaker, people speaker for the disabled and LGBT communities and so on. Or if there aren't speakers as such, if it's just in a conversation, they will at first go to the woman or minority people in the room to let them speak first and to make sure that they are heard. I think that's a really good way to ensure that the power imbalance that you talk about doesn't continue, that it isn't just the very articulate, white, male, straight men who manage to get to speak.
Any more questions from the crowd?
Mr. Tatchell, you come from a very interesting perspective where not only are you a political
kind of representative, but also you're a singular activist. And I would love to know if there's anything that has been afforded to you from that perspective that you found has served you very well. Like, I thought it was particularly evident in your retelling of your interaction, if you will, with Mugabe, that your basis for that was a legal one in the citizen's arrest, but certainly the carrying out of it, not once, arguably 4 times, was one of kind of direct action of activism. I was wondering if there's anything that you have learned from that approach, from both of those perspectives, that you feel has served you very well in your kind of, in your strive for change, if you will.
Well, I guess my inspirations from my teenage years, and I began when I was 15, were people like Mohandas Gandhi, Sylvia Pankhurst, Martin Luther King, and to some extent, Malcolm X and Rosa Luxemburg. Each of those people in a different way had some unique ideas and some unique methods. So what I tried to do was adapt or take from their ideas and methods and adapt them and, you know, reformulate them for the struggles that I'm involved in. And of course, they all were people of direct action. Not because direct action and civil disobedience is the only way, it's not. But when you're faced with intransigence by people in power, it probably is the only way to get through that. So there's been many times when I've sat down with government ministers, church leaders and others. We've had a cup of tea and biscuits and we've discussed an issue, and in some cases, surprisingly, things have changed. But often it's been the case that they won't even meet me or the movement that I'm part of. And so in those instances, the choice is either let them have their way and ignore us, or we escalate. And I think that the non-violent approach of Gandhi and Martin Luther King is much the most effective, because you retain the moral authority and power, you avoid violence becoming a distraction, so you keep focused on the issue. And it does become embarrassing for people in power when they're called out in that way. It's much easier for them to dismiss a rabble or a riotous crowd or people who engage in violence. That's easy for them to dismiss. And then they get the kudos or they get the brownie points. But if you're non-violent and you do something that's perhaps maybe even putting yourself in some danger, that tends to ultimately inspire at least a grudging respect. And I think that all throughout history, first of all, every successful movement has been a collective one. And it's true with all my campaigns. You know, I've mentioned, you know, that outraged people were involved with me in going into the pulpit in Canterbury Cathedral and in the attempted citizen's arrest of Mugabe in London. I couldn't have done it without them. So for me, it's fundamental to recognize that the most successful, effective campaigns are collective ones. It's when we unite together as a large group of people, or even just perhaps quite a small group of people, but an effective small group of people, that we are more likely to succeed. So it's a practical issue. But it's also an important issue of principle. Because to me, I'm not doing this, but I'm doing it because I believe in it, I'm following my conscience, but I'm doing it because I want to see change for myself and other people as well. So that collective principle is really important. But as Rosa Luxemburg argued, every successful action is a collective one, but every moral action is for the sake of the individual. And she was arguing against Lenin, and obviously later, if she had lived, against Stalin, where they argued that the rights of the collective override the rights of the individual, that the ends justify the means. And Rosa Luxemburg said, no, the ends must be compatible with the means. If you use bad methods, you'll end up achieving bad ends. And I think that's a really important principle. And I've tried as best I can, imperfectly, to guide that through my human rights work.
Anyone at all? No? Phil, your question?
My last question, so I won't keep. Well, it's not more a question more than a comment. I said it earlier, and I want to say it again. Thank you for all the work you've done for my generation, and I truly, truly mean it. You are one of the guiding lights for equality in the world, for human rights in the world, and I think that's something that we've learned is that gay rights are part of the broader family of human rights, and you've really kind of, I think, shown us a message of hope that even when you're faced with, the front of Robert Mugabe's car, or whether you're, facing off against a government minister, or indeed just talking with a government minister, that change is possible. And all it takes is one person to have an idea, or to have the inspiration to really go out and try and fix something they see as an injustice. And for collective action, that's probably one of the key things, is that it's so important. So it's, in particular in university, I think it's really important that we take your message and we continue to fight with it, continue on into future generations to do that. So thank you very much for your contribution over 50 years. Thank you.
Just on that point, I don't mean to diminish the role of the individual. I think individuals like Gandhi or Martin Luther King can be really important, but their effectiveness is only when they've got a mass movement behind them. So Gandhi himself alone could not have forced the British out of India. And what an extraordinary achievement. What was then the greatest military superpower in history was forced out of India without a single shot being fired. As often said, Gandhi and his followers did not harm a single hair on the head of a single British soldier. Yet the greatest empire at that time in history was forced to retreat from India through non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. That is an extraordinary, amazing, monumental human achievement. So individuals are important, but they need the collective behind them. Can I just finish by just saying that perhaps to give you an idea of how I got into this originally, my first political memory was in 1963. I was 11 years old, and I read and heard about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered by white racists. They threw a bomb into the church on a Sunday morning. At 11 years old, I remember thinking to myself, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? I was just so shocked. And that prompted my interest in the Black Civil Rights Movement. And because I was brought in a very devoutly religious family, I could very much relate to Martin Luther King being a Baptist minister. I'm not religious anymore, but I was in those days. So I related to him and the Black Civil Rights Movement. So I all through my teenage years, I followed the Black Civil Rights Movement. I used to watch those nightly news bulletins of civil rights marches, of people sitting in at lunch counters that refused to serve black people, of going into stores where sections of stores were reserved for white people only, and just thinking how wrong it is and how right people are to challenge it. So when I realized I was gay in 1969 at the age of 17, this was in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. There were no gay rights organisations. I'd never heard of the gay rights movement. In fact, there basically was no gay rights movement anywhere in the world. Well, there was in the Netherlands and Denmark and a few other places, but no one had ever heard of it. I remember thinking to myself, I get it. If black people are an oppressed minority, then so are gay people. We're an oppressed minority like black people. And if black people have a right for equal rights, so do we. And if black people are prepared to fight for their rights, we have to fight for our rights. So that was sort of the lodestar that began me on my first campaigns. I remember also thinking it had taken the Black Civil Rights Movement about 50 years from when they really got going until finally the last segregationist laws were repealed and, for the most part, voting rights were restored. So again, I thought to myself, if it's taken black Americans about 50 years to win equal rights, I guess it'll probably take about 50 years for LGBT people to win equal rights. And I remember thinking at that time, 17, boy, I'll be quite old by the time that comes. But I intend to do my bit. I'm going to do my bit like all those black civil rights marchers did their bit. It was the individuals who came together to fight for black rights that eventually defeated segregation in the Deep South and eventually won voting rights. So I pay enormous inspiration and tribute to the black civil rights movement because it has given me a template, if you like, a model of how to do campaigning and direct action. First of all, I want to just say my thanks again for inviting me today. It's been a great honor to join you, and thank you for all coming. I've got some flyers about my Human Rights Foundation. I have a small foundation, the Peter Tatchell Foundation, which campaigns for about 50% for LGBT rights and about 50% for other human rights, such as free speech, civil liberties, and so on. About 50% of it is UK-based and about 50% overseas, mostly in Russia, Pakistan, Uganda, Nigeria, West Papua, and the Western Sahara. We're supporting human rights and democracy movements and self-determination movements in those countries. So if you're interested, please take one. On the back, it tells you on the green bar how to sign up for the email bulletins. It's all free, and also about Facebook and Twitter. So please take one and please sign up. You'll be most welcome. You become part of our little human rights community. If you want to take one for a friend or a colleague, do so. If you know someone, perhaps, I know poor students haven't got any money, but maybe your mums or dads or relatives might be sympathetic, please ask them to consider making a donation as well, because we depend entirely on donations from well-wishers to sustain our work. We don't get any organised funding, you know. Governments don't fund citizens' arrest of President Mugabe or invading the pulpit of Canterbury Cathedral. So we depend on well-wishers. So please take one. And go on the website and you'll see the range of issues we do. And if you're studying anything around social sciences, you'll probably find an issue there of interest to you. And there's also my personal website as well, which is petertatchell.net. But this is the foundation one. Anyway, thank you once again.